stand for a rendition of the national anthem of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana.
Dear land of Guyana, of rivers and plains made rich by the sunshine and lush by the rain, set gem-light and fair between mountains and seas. Your children salute you, dear land of the free. Dear land of Guyana, to you will we give our home. Made your service each day that we live. God guard you, great mother, and make us to be more worthy our heritage, land of the free.
You, great mother, and make us to be more worthy our heritage, land of the free. Thank you very much, Miss Omaya Hall, Junior Calypso Monarch, for that beautiful rendition of our national anthem. Welcome to the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana's special Independence edition of its Spill the Facts online talk show series. Tonight's program is themed Independence and Nationhood, #44, as we seek to explore Guyana's development as a nation, pre and post-independence, and propose actions for how Guyana can move forward. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. If at any point during the program you're feeling hungry, a wide variety of Guyanese cuisine is available. Callaloo cooked up with fish and fried plantains prepared by Keishel Jennings, and Chinese fried rice prepared by Auntie Sue are available. Additionally, loud duck and laba curry is available, and some delicious pepper pot and cassava bread are available. I would like to invite everyone, especially those who are wearing the African print and colors of the national flag, to turn on your video so that we can liven the atmosphere. And so forward in our program, I would just like to give some basic rules. As much as possible, please try to keep your mics muted, or else you may be faced with sanctions. For persons who are desirous of asking questions throughout the program, you can do so using the chat, and when the questions and answer segment is here, we will read out some of your questions for the panelists. Great. So I would like to thank all the persons who are tuning in, those from Linden, from Berbice, from Essequibo, from Baitika, from Georgetown. Thank you for tuning in, those in the diaspora. And we have a wonderful program in store for you guys. So to begin our program, my co-host, Miss Elsie Harry, will perform a spoken word followed by a steel pan rendition by Mr. Hanani Ben Louis.
Thank you so much, Matthew. This piece is called Ode to Guyana. She was strong and full of life when I met her. A lot older than me, but we still grew together. Yet I was young and couldn't understand the kind of pressure she was under. May 26th was a special day, and she reveled in it. She wanted so much this time for all of her people to benefit. She told me how long and hard was the struggle to be free, and how this fight for freedom was led by indomitable personalities like Burnham and Chetty. How she loved them, her children, how she loved them. She would cradle me in her arms at night and rock me to sleep in her Atlantic breeze. In the morning, I would wake up to fruit trees and be pleased to hear about her ancestry. She told me she was proud of her heritage, how her children were from different lineages. A land of 6 peoples she had adopted as her own and carved a nation. She gave birth to leaders, statesmen, and women. She fed her children from her womb, educated them on her lap, and lent them to the world. Walter Rodney, Sir Sridhar Ramphal, Clive Lloyd, Eddie Grant, and Martin Carter. Those are her children, and she continues to love them. Even though today we are spread out across the world, Guyana still loves how our voices sing to the hum of her rhythm. Oh, beautiful Guyana, oh, my lovely native land, more dear to me than all the world, thy sea-washed, sun-kissed strand. Or down upon the borders, looking out upon the deep, the great Atlantic blown into a fury, or asleep. And oh, you should see her majesty. Kaichor Falls, Takatu, the Rupununi, Potaro, Siparuni, Mount Roraima, and Kanji. She is a beauty. From river to coast, she used to boast of her self-sufficiency, the breadbasket of the Caribbean, the Garden City. That was her legacy. Even though today we are spread out across the world, as daughters and sons of the soil, it is our duty to toil to restore her to her former glory. Great land of Guyana, to you will we give our homage, our service, each day that you live. God guard you, great mother, and make us to be more worthy of our heritage. Mother, Guyana, you will always be free. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you very much, Miss Harry and Mr. Ben Louis, for those wonderful displays of talent. Elsie, do you have a few words for us tonight?
Yes, of course. I wanted to take the opportunity to welcome everyone to a special Independence edition of our Spill the Facts series. Spill the Facts, it is IDPADA-G's Youth Committee's newest venture. This is about our 6th episode, and we just want to thank you so much for tuning in. It's called Spill the Facts because we place emphasis on producing factual content. So tonight we will be discussing independence and nationhood. We hope you will enjoy it. We will introduce our panelists next. And if you have a question for the panelists during the presentation, feel free to type the questions in the chat box. And right after the panel discussion, we will read out your questions for the panelists to answer. Our first speaker for this evening is Mr. Sharma Solomon. He is currently a manager at the National Data Management Authority, who formerly served as the regional chairman of the Regional Democratic Council for Region 10. He has a wealth of social and political knowledge gathered from his political work at the grassroots level, and currently he is a final year student at the University of Guyana, pursuing a Bachelor of Social Science degree in International Relations, where he is working on his final year research project, which is based on foreign policy and Guyana's electoral system. Matthew, do you want to go ahead and introduce our next speaker?
Our second speaker is Dr. Dwayne Edwards. He currently lectures in the discipline of sociology at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. His areas of interest include ethnic dynamics in plural societies such as Guyana, Caribbean philosophical and development thought, and sociocultural systems in developing societies. He graduated with a doctoral degree in sociology with high commendation at UW Cave Hill in 2019. He is currently editing, along with Professor Ralph Premdas, a special series of the Social and Economic Studies Journal, published by the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies in Jamaica. The series will focus on oil production and the socio-economic implications for Guyana's development.
Our final panelist for this evening, but by no means least, is Mr. Aubrey Norton. He is an academic, a well-known political activist, and a long-standing member of one of the major political parties in Guyana, the People's National Congress Reform. He is a former lecturer at the University of Guyana, and most recently, former presidential advisor on youth empowerment. He has offered political commentary on a number of issues pertinent to Guyana's development and has a wealth of knowledge about Guyana's independence struggle and the philosophical underpinnings of what independence and nationhood means in the Guyanese context. With that final introduction, I will invite our first speaker, Mr. Sharma Solomon, to make his presentation. He will be followed by Dr. Dwayne Edwards, and Dr. Edwards will be followed by Mr. Aubrey Norton. Mr. Solomon, the floor is yours.
Oh, I was just trying to unmute. Thank you very much, Elsie. And good evening to all. Blessings by the grace of Almighty God. Just allow me to say that I'm very humbled to have been invited to this forum. I've actually looked at the first few forums that you guys would have hosted. And I would like to especially thank Ms. Olive Sampson, who called me personally to invite me to this. She represents as the CEO for the International Decade of People of African Descent Assembly, Guyana chapter. She also invited me before to one of your forums at the Artichon Convention Center. and to you, the host, for having me and these very esteemed gentlemen this evening on this panel. Being born in Linden in the 70s and growing up in this community with so much intimate stories of Guyana's quest for self-determination and to being a witness as it was being played out uh, through the issues of the quest for republicanism and nationalization, have excited my interest on the issues of early self-determination quests such as emancipation and the independence struggle. For those who know Linden and Region 10, we are the epicenter of what we call the fundamental economic pillar within Guyana, which is the bauxite industry, and which at times during the political independence stood as one of the key foundation stone on which this nation would have advanced. So with high hopes, people who in this community, and I'm certain across Guyana, had the opportunity to see the industry advance and develop and what intentions they thought that would have brought to them. But these benefits from earlier and in the form of self-determination, these benefits quickly evaporated and the remnants of the colonial structures of administration remained. Thus, the push for self-determination constructs of republicanism and nationalization. There is a good book by Odida Kwamina that pointed out the constructs that even though we overcame the emancipation struggles and we were after independence in this community, the bauxite industry still represented a very colonialistic foundation on how it was built. So with this background, I've been fortunate to have had my own experiences, good or bad, in this community with this strong desire for self-determination. And it played itself out to a certain level. And with that inheritance of militancy that we as a community grew to appreciate many of the union's struggle that we embrace, that influenced my outlook in terms of appreciating just that environment to be birthed in. So that in 2012, we had our own struggles to be part of that decision-making process, which in itself represented that quest for self-determination. But I believe coming back to the point of independence after 54 years, and in fact, before we got to independence after 400 years of recognizing that it wasn't easy to keep people in captivity, which was not without its many revolts and revolution and rebellion, and its many social reconstructions and restructuring to satisfy the plantocracy and the crown. It required a further 128 years before Guyana made its next bold step for self-determination, which was the independence struggle of the mid-60s to the late 70s. And I always represented the independence struggle to incorporate not only the Republican struggle, but nationalization, because I saw them all as part of self-determination. And what we saw is in recognizing that self-determination was not just how we hold society in bondage and coming out of bondage of the colonial struggle. The challenge was after that, I think is where the next part of this forum emphasis, I believe, will be very important for persons who are paying attention and who will be contributing to make, which was in itself the building of this nation. And it was really nation building. And the challenge was now the business on how do we get people to understand and to accept nationhood, nation building within this multiracial, multicultural society that people after these quests for self-determination found themselves in. So if the early part of our history was concerned with the struggles against the dehumanization of enslavement and indentureship, and for those struggles that even our Amerindian brothers and sisters themselves overcame, it could be said that the latter part of our history and the part that begins with independence has been preoccupied with how we build this nation. Guyana, with its many races, with its social structures deliberately built by our colonizers, its rich natural resources, mixed with its presence of complex ethnic identity after 54 years of independence struggle. And for that quest of nationhood, I believe is still wanting. Um, what these complexities brought by the enslaved, with these, in fact, complexities that were brought by the enslaved Africans and indentured Indians and our other races, set the stage for a lot of tension from the very beginning, where those who struggled against enslavement and who bore the brunt of what the colonial harshness would have brought. And for our Indian brothers and sisters who many believe, and I was looking at a very good program a few nights ago by one of the profound Indians who pronounced on many of these issues, Mr. Ravidev. And it was mentioning in that context that where the Africans saw that they would have bore the brunt of struggling to bring about these self-determination quests, our Indian brothers and some of the other races saw that indeed it was them who reaped the benefit. So you had this early distrust even within the early days of our independence struggle. And I believe it was after that struggle of commonness where we not only had our independence in 66, but where we had our Republican status as we attained. And in that push for a nationalist recognition through nationalization, those common elements, after they would have vanished, left this society, left this nation with people who were wanting and who were searching. And I believe beneath the surface then of this and other relationship, there is a resentment within competition, victimhood, shame, guilt. And despite our great possibilities and the contribution made by each group within the sphere of its ingenuity, tensions consume our energies. And it still does. I mean, look at it today as we speak. Our elections are no more closer to finishing than it started. And these tensions consume so much of what we can put towards as it relates to nation building. And it would have placed each group on the defensive and limit the quality of our creativeness to address how we move ahead in the future of ensuring we have a better nation. Against this background is that we find the interest, and I believe fundamental to nationhood emerging from 54 years of independence. For me, it's a reintroduction and a welcoming of each other within this new dynamics as we understand it. Whether it's liberating the creative relationships that we have within ourselves, and where do we begin? So we have to look at the construct of where the Europeans, who principally were the beneficiaries from African enslavement, and do not have, I don't think, and if we look even today, not necessarily Europeans, but outsiders, we still yearn for that quest for them to come and solve our problems. I don't think there is going to be a sincere desire coming from those era that we came from for outsiders to be sincere enough to want to resolve our differences. It requires us in this nation, in this country, our people, difference in race, ethnicity, culture, religion, to see how we can fix those insecurity. And among ourselves to secure enough that we are trustworthy of each other and respectful of the injustices faced by each side. And I believe I will put my pen there for now to say that until we overcome that level of mistrust, it will be when we begin to respect the suffering each of us endure as a people coming out of those structures that were set to ensure that we live the way we are right now, such as enslavement and indentureship. So it's a very complex situation, but I believe that once we as a people are prepared to overcome those differences that brought us to this point, those challenges will be easy to overcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solomon. Our next speaker is Dr. Dwayne Edwards. The floor is yours, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ari. And thank you to the organizers for having me here this evening. And to be among what I'm seeing, it seems to be a very illustrious group of youngsters. And to speak on this very important topic, especially in this moment in the Guyanese history. In the time allotted, I want to do three things to the extent that I could really favorably address three questions in this time allotted. I want to, first of all, demonstrate that in many ways, the social, the structural, and cultural realities in Guyana have changed little since independence. That's one issue I want to address. Secondly, I want to identify or pinpoint a few reasons why that is so, why we have failed to bring about deep-rooted changes in the society. And last of all, I want to also pinpoint some possibilities that are open to us in an environment characterized by globalization of culture, taste, knowledge, and production, and characterized by a more outward-looking rather than an inward-looking approach to nationhood. Starting with the first, and I want to start by reading a speech by the Minister of Finance in 2016, I think was part of his budget speech in 2016. Interestingly, 2016 was our Golden Jubilee. So it was the 50th anniversary of our independence. And a couple months before that the independence celebration, in the budget speech of the then Prime Minister, he said, and I quote, "Last year was a difficult one for our economy. While I do not wish to chronicle all of the events that were responsible for that state of affairs, suffice it to say that because of the characteristics of the economy bequeathed to us at the time of independence have changed little, we have suffered tremendously. In 2015, perhaps for the first time in recent history, all of our country's key industries, sugar, rice, bauxite, gold, and forestry, found themselves in various states of distress. It is obvious that our excessive reliance on these generators of foreign exchange will continue to expose the economy to volatile external development." This excerpt from the budget speech of the Minister of Finance points to the fact that since independence, there have been little changes in the economic structure. We still depend on a small selection of primary commodities, which shows the extent to which formal political independence failed to translate into anything substantial, economically speaking. If we look at what is unfolding currently with regards to the March the second election in Guyana, we see that the same conflicts which beset us during the struggle for independence, immediately pre and immediately post-independence, are still very much with us today. Our political institutions and culture are therefore marred by similar problems as the economy as outlined by the Minister of Finance. If we look at our social relations, we see the similar problems plaguing us that plagued us since the time of independence and before. If many of you would have been exposed to a racist rant on Facebook by Indo-Guyanese female, and that if we take that as representative of how the various ethnic groups and racial groups in Guyana relate to each other or see each other, then I think that shows that from independence to now, we have failed miserably in bringing about the qualitative kinds of changes that we would want to see in our social relations. The various groups still depend on myths and stereotypes constructed largely by colonialists as part of a divide and rule strategy, right? So I've given you 3 examples there. One that shows our economy really hasn't changed much. Our political culture, political institutions, our political relations are still plagued by the same problems that they were plagued by in the 1960s. And our social relations bear the same stamp. Bearing those facts in mind, the question is, what have we missed since independence? Where have we gone wrong? Why as nationhood, if we measure that in more substantial rather than symbolic terms, why as nationhood seems so evasive, right? So I will attempt to answer that question briefly, and then I will also attempt to highlight some possibilities, things that we can do now, because as Sharma Solomon said, and I agree, the independence struggle was part of a broader struggle for freedom that started not necessarily with the emancipation, but started before with the many struggles by our various national heroes against slavery and enslavement. Started since the Africans who were brought from Africa to the various parts of the West Indies, opted to jump off their ships rather than to be enslaved. So independence is just one iteration of a broader struggle for freedom. And some of the demands, some of the factors that keep us in bondage are still with us today, which means the demand for that resistance in various aspects of our life are still with us today. But in spite of that, no one could deny that there were genuine attempts made to fortify our nationhood, to fortify our independence in the post-independent era. Across the Caribbean, just as in Guyana, we have independence heroes that have done a lot with regards to achieving a certain quality and measure of independence and nationhood. And chief among those, of course, would be Forbes Barnum, who was the actual leader when we gained independence in 1966. And I don't have to enumerate many of the positive things he have done. I think those are well known, but just to list a few, he promoted a nationalist ideology, and he also established the accompanying institutions to operationalize that ideology within the nation. He gave formal recognition to the various religious and cultural expressions that were extant in the society at that time as a way of forging social cohesion. He elevated the arts in national life. He's responsible for Republican status and designed an economic arrangement which catered to the needs of various groups in the society. So, apart from Borno, we also had Chedi Dragon, we had other leaders along with two of them that no doubt contributed a lot and have left us a legacy that is worth building on. So, but while many of our independence heroes struggled to deepen and to enrich our independence, of course, they were faced with tremendous obstacles. They were faced with tremendous setbacks, tremendous struggles, right? And this is something that is hardly emphasized in the discourses in Guyana, especially, I think we like to beat up on our like past leaders and pinpoint the failures, and we hardly pinpoint some of the struggles that they have had to battle against, some of the difficulties that they were faced with. And so I think it's important that we also recognize those. It's important because in recognizing those, then we would be able to adjust ourselves to what are the current demands and the difficulties that come with those demands, right? And one of those difficulties was the immediate nature of poverty and underdevelopment in the colonies and post-colonies. So our leaders at the independence time, they were, and even in the pre-independence era, they were faced with the Herculean task of pulling these various societies out of the depth of poverty and economic underdevelopment. So in an effort to try to raise the standard of living of our people, there were little, what we would call wiggle room left for resources, time and attention, mental and otherwise, to be spent on the other trappings of independence. There was also, one of the other shortcomings is that there was an over-dependence or reliance on political leadership and on the private sector as two key actors in developing these newly independent nations. So politics and business took the forefront of development thinking and so forth, which means the role of academics, the role of cultural activists and other important movers and shakers in society became secondary to those of the politicians and those of the business actors. The result of that is that the necessary symbolic aspect of nationhood, of independence, the necessary ideological aspect of nationhood and independence were not developed to such a state that to make our people more inward looking rather than outward looking, right? So I think one of the lessons that is still relevant today is that however we measure nationhood, there are key roles to be played by persons that outside of the political realm or outside of the economic realm, right? And and I list a few of these various actors. One of the other shortcomings was the approach to independence was very statist and it's very elitist, right? So it left on the sideline a lot of other important actors, as I said before. And I think this is very much a critique of Burnham's approach, although it in many other areas, it was admirable and it went further than most other Caribbean leaders, is that there was a predominantly Afro-Creole approach to nationhood and nationalism in a society that was plural in its essence. While that approach worked in Caribbean countries in which they were like, in which the population, 90% of the population were Afro-Caribbean people. That approach, the Afro-Creole approach, was very problematic within the Caribbean context. So while the Afro-Guyanese section of the population would have been very invigorated, there were various other sections of the population that saw their culture not fully represented in this new nationalism or this new nationalist ideology that was being forged like in the post-independence period, right? So in my estimation, those are just a few things that affected our quest towards nationhood and our quest towards really cementing our independence. And by independence, as you see, I took a less symbolic approach to it and a more substantial approach, where independence to me is more operationalized in terms of economic development, social cohesion, and inward-looking cultural orientation, and things like that. So having said all of that, are the concepts of independence and nationalism still necessary or still relevant within a context of globalization, within a context where everyone wants to travel away from like spheres and countries such as Guyana and travel more towards what are called the metropolitan centers? Bearing that reality in mind, as are independence and nationhood and nationalism, are these concepts still relevant? What can we, is it still useful as nations to pursue these as national ideals, or are we wasting time? And as a response to this question, I want to read a quote by a very renowned cultural theorist and post-colonial scholar by the name of Shalini Puri. And according to Shalini Puri, who argues for the relevance of nationalism even in a globalized sphere, post-nationalist theories implicitly privilege metropolitan centers as the objects and site of political action. Right. Bearing that in mind, I would add also that cultural production and knowledge production also are centered mostly in these metropolitan spheres. So independence and nationhood would have to mean, if it is to be meaningful, the invigorating of the means and mechanisms through which we produced our own culture, we produced our own knowledge, we produced our own products, and we produced our own self of being as nations. And I think that is what, I think if nothing else, that is what Forbes Burnham left us with as one of his important legacies. So, taken up from Shalini Puri, so even in the 21st century, the idea of nationalism is still relevant. But of course, while there are lessons to learn from the past, both positive and negative, we must also be mindful that there are pitfalls to avoid. And one of which, as I said, is the statist and the top-down approach to nationhood, and the top-down approach or the statist approach to development. The other part is that in plural societies such as Guyana, the state is often captured by one of a few different ethnic elites who invariably use the state as a means to enrich and to empower their own ethnic elites, and by extension, the ethnic group. Being mindful of that fact, approaches to nationhood are better when they are implemented from the ground up, implemented in a way which our own Wilson Harris, very insightful writer, implemented in such a way that we called from the different groups that which we have in common and build upon that, build I don't want to say Creole, but a hybrid culture that we could use as the basis of our nationhood and the basis of our development trust, our development drive, and in order to strengthen and solidify our independence in all areas of social life, economic, political, and if we look at what is happening with the election in Guyana, and the many bold statements coming from international observers and players, one become very concerned for the independence of our political sphere. So by independence, we mean in the independence in the economy, independence in the political sphere, independence in all areas of social life. And that approach, as I say, as I'm emphasizing, is best achieved by a more bottom-up rather than a state-centrist approach to nationhood and independence. And that is my contribution for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. Remember, if you all have any questions that you want to ask, please type them in the chat box. And as soon as the final panelist speaks, we will begin the question and answer segment. Our final panelist is Mr. Aubrey Norton. Mr. Norton, the floor is yours.
First of all, let me say thanks for having me. It always pleases me when the younger generation is discussing issues that I believe are to be discussed because they're critical. I want to shift the focus a little. Essentially, I believe that when we talk about independence, the word struggle must come side by side with it, which I think Mr. Solomon made, though not in that fashion. And if one accepts that, one accepts almost axiomatically that you will have an opponent. Independence is not going to come by people who dominate in you, wanting you to be independent. Always remember, when you are dependent, people benefit from you. And those who benefit are not inclined to emancipate you. And so self-emancipation is critical. Now, let us put it in context. We're talking about Guyana, an ethnically divided society, a class-divided society, though there are times when ethnicity causes the class lines to be blurred. A society that has a divided psyche. If you talk to people who like Burnham, Burnham is God. And to those who don't like him, he's demon. If you talk to those who like Dr. Jagan, to them he's God. And those who don't like Dr. Jagan, he's demon. So you have a divided psyche. That apart, you're operating in a world that people are calling a globalized world. I like to say a world in which information technology contributed to rapid changes that ensured further underdevelopment and ensure further dependency. I do not like taking technology outside of the context of the political economic structure. If we accept that, then we come to the real question to be answered. How do we make this class divided, ethnically divided society operating in the context of a globalized world, in which those in charge of the global world wants to continue your domination. On the other hand, your people are in poverty and they want to come out of poverty. But a lot of times they subscribe to the dominant ideology of the developed world that is keeping you in poverty. Listen to our radio station. There is one particular young lady on Hits and Jams. She comes and gives you all of these celebrities in the United States of America. And she spent a lot of time not recognizing what she's doing is helping the United States and other countries with what is called the use of soft power. It's a form of psychological domination. So we don't only have to break economic domination, we have to break socio-psychological domination that in large measure informs our thinking or sometimes lack of thinking. Now, when one puts that together, then one sees the real task. To build a nation, there have to be commonalities around which the nation rallies. At present, we have a lot of differences which divides the nation, including this governance system, which is a winner-take-all system. And I've argued that after every election, there will be confusion and problems until you have a system in which all the people or the majority of the people in the society feel that they are part of it and they have a stake in it. What I'm saying here is that a lot of the extant conditions are conditions that are not propitiously disposed to independence. They are conditions that entrench your underdevelopment and dependency. And therefore, if we're going to talk about independence and nationhood, I believe we have to first solve some of the governance issues and try and arrive at a governance model that make all the ethnic groups or all the ethnic groups feel they have a stake in the national cake. If one doesn't do that, you will always have a divided society. I want to just go back in history. Burnham and Jagan were able between 1949 to 1953 to develop some semblance of a mass movement towards independence. And of course, of their own doing, and the international world, at the time not called global, but it was the same thing, that process unraveled. I believe we have to come up with a governance strategy for Guyana and then do the kind of mobilization we did in the 50s and early 60s. And I'm defining mobilization here to mean bringing people into active political use to achieve particular ideological governance objectives. Once you do that mobilization, you have to have the concomitant consciousness to go with it. A lot of times we miss that you have to reorient people's thinking if you're going to carry them in a particular direction. Because a man first thinks, or most times, before he or she acts. And when their thinking is guided by a particular development philosophy, then you stand a chance of developing first your independence and moving on to nationhood. In a nutshell, I'm saying to you, one, I buy Dr. Edwards' point that the structure of the economy is a problem. I buy Mr. Solomon's point that we face enemies, but I also believe that those that I have added are critical. When you add to that, that nations develop based on its human resources. One of the mistakes we make in this society is to always talk about the wealth we got in the ground, the oil, the potential. All of that is irrelevant if you don't have the professional and technical capability to develop it. It means it will be controlled by those with such capabilities. We're seeing Exxon coming here. We've seen they bring in the skills. And it is not that Guyanese don't have the skills, but a lot of the Guyanese with the skills are in the diaspora. And they become accustomed to a certain way of life. And to get many of them to come home will be like pulling teeth without cocaine. So let us also underscore the fact that Ghana has to develop some approach in which when it trains its people, they're able to be utilized. That will also demand a change in our approach to management. Unfortunately, we have developed a kind of an autocratic, authoritarian approach to management, in which we only want to hear what we have to say. And we seem not to understand that more people looking at it, discuss it, and arriving at conclusions give you a better product than somebody who believes they know it all. They are the end it all of knowledge. I believe we have to take a different approach to management of affairs in Guyana. One in which people accept that people have professional skills, allow them to operate as professionals. And there are some professionals too, who when you entrust them, believing that they are professionals, they operate based on political party positions. And so we have also a crisis in a civil service. We do not have a civil service that is independent, for the want of a word. We live in a small society in which each other know our political affiliation, and politics tend to become involved and affect the management making decision in the system. Again, I believe that is a critical aspect that we have to deal with if we're going to build a nation and move on to independence. Because your economic structure has to change, which I agree, some people said before. Your political structure has to change. Your approach to management has to change. We have to develop the consciousness of the Guyanese people so they are able to sit down and decide what is in their interest. Don't let's fool ourselves. We live in a society until now when Europeans and North Americans speak, intelligent people believe they are right. When there are other humans like us, sometimes with less intellectual capacity, but we start by believing they are right. And so there is this urgent need for mass mobilization, consciousness raising, and to develop a belief in ourselves. A lot of times we don't believe in ourselves. We believe somebody has to solve the problem for us. And I believe that when anybody comes to solve the problems for you, they will solve it in their interests. And your interests will suffer. There are cases where there are going to be a coincidence and confluence of interests, but generally, people operate based on their own interests. And so I'm saying to you that we need a complete metamorphosis in our approach. And at the bottom of it, we must remember Bob Marley, that there must be mental emancipation. We must have a clear idea of what would have happened to us, what is happening to us now, and what we need to do to change it to ensure that we can operate and develop an independent society. And independence in itself is not nationhood. Having developed that independent society, simultaneously seek to develop nationhood. Those are my comments at this stage.
Thank you so much, Mr. Norton. Thank you, Dr. Edwards and Mr. Sharma Solomon. The floor is now open for questions. One of the first questions that we got in the chat box was from Dr. Terrence Isaacs, and he directed it to Mr. Solomon. He said, what steps can Afro-Guyanese take to begin the process of reconciliation? I will assume that this is in response to something that you said in your presentation, Mr. Solomon. So that question is for you.
Thanks for the question, Doctor. This is, interestingly, I had the opportunity to read an article in 2008 from Earl Lovelace, and a poet and one of a very talented writer from Trinidad, the late Lovelace. And he had written about his book, Salt. And in that book, it represented the issue of how do we welcome? And I think points made by our speakers before dealt with the assumption, and I think we are here, but it dealt with the assumption that we have gotten past our mistrust and the, in essence, lack of respect for the struggles of each race within our society. I think we take for granted. And what Mr. Lovelace was actually saying, it is who is best positioned to welcome. And he was actually articulating it as us, because us meaning the Africans throughout the Caribbean, the diaspora, and he equated that struggle with the civil rights movement. But back to where he was actually saying, who initiates that welcome? Because we cannot depend on those who were the beneficiaries of slavery and who still dominates, as Mr. Norton said, the global political systems, to sincerely do that for us. And on the side of our East Indian brothers, and I by what he was saying, is that they have not experienced not being beneficiaries in whatever context that is. And in looking for our new reality as a people, that brings that sort of better appreciation. Who does the welcoming? And I think once we as a society, if not embrace in essence Mr. Lovelace's principle, but understand that we take for granted each other's struggle and see where we can find building trust, then we can get past so many things. Once we cannot find trust, once we cannot initiate that reintroduction, it becomes difficult for us to move beyond any other thing. Even in this globalized society, the world is globalized and it's moving, but we still have those elements that are not, as Dr. rightly said, after independence, we are in a very thinly way showing any movement towards better development. And I think that essence of trust is what needs to be dealt with. So to answer your question, Doc, I buy that we should be the ones doing the welcoming. We should try to initiate some level of developmental agenda that says, where do we open up? And I think I listened to the president on Mark Benchcop program a few nights ago, and I got just that message, just to answer you.
If I can, could I come in here?
Yes, sure.
Look, I want to say this. While I agree to a point that we have got to meet out, the other side has got to meet out. But since I'm one who believes that power relations determine, I believe the first task for African Guyanese is to get into agriculture, to get into business, to ensure they have an independent economic capacity. Unless there is an independent economic capacity, there is dependency somewhere. And so in the African agenda, I have always argued that you have to argue for equity. For instance, don't tell me that you will give me a percentage of small contracts while the big contractors dominate. There must be in that equity. And so I believe to solving this problem, we need to focus on equity. And I also object to us making this an Afro-Indo issue. The Amerindians in this country need economic empowerment, need to be made to stand independent on their own. And so I believe we have to take a holistic approach to the development of the people of Guyana to be able to deal with these problems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Norton. Our question is directed to Dr. Dwayne Edwards from Dr. Isaacs. If we are to achieve nationhood in the Guyana context, how can we get other ethnicities in Guyana on board?
Thank you, Matthew. Very important question, and I'll try my best to answer it to the best of my ability. First of all, I think I would want to rephrase the question, and I don't think it's the responsibility of any ethnic group to get any other ethnic group on board, right? I think what we're looking at here is collective responsibility, that collective consciousness emanating from all ethnic groups. And I talk a lot about bottom-up approach, and I think I will go to that later. But let me just say for now that it's no easy task. First of all, our different ethnic groups are separated structurally. And what I mean by that, I mean that the indigenous peoples who dwell largely in the interland communities, the Afro-Guyanese who dwell largely in urban areas, Indo-Guyanese dwell largely in rural areas. So there's this geographic differentiation of the ethnic groups. Then there's also an occupational differentiation of the ethnic groups, which is why I like what was just said by Aubrey Norton, that Afro-Guyanese should get into agriculture, but he was emphasizing the economic aspect of it for economic independence sake. The aspect that I want to emphasize is that I don't think it becomes very problematic when one ethnic group is associated with one economic occupation, one geographic sphere, and things like that. Because it becomes easy, it presents opportunities for discrimination, for favor. If we take Norton's approach, where Africans take up agriculture, then it becomes problematic for any group to that are rendering assistance to persons operating in the agricultural sphere to discriminate against the Afro-Guyanese group. That's because both Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese are agriculturalists. For example, I'll give you a very concrete examples with the government and the closure of the sugar estates. If Afro-Guyanese were equally into the sugar business, sugar plantation, and these estates were closed, it would have been difficult for that to be used as a political tool or to manipulate ethnic sentiments. Right? That is because the sugar estate closing would have affected not only Indo-Guyanese or largely Indo-Guyanese directly, but also Afro-Guyanese or even indigenous people or the other ethnic groups. So when we have a situation where various ethnic groups are randomly distributed across various occupations and geographic sphere, it becomes difficult for discrimination to be effected along ethnic lines. If one community is known as predominantly one ethnic group and the other political parties in power, it's easy to discriminate against that community. But how do you discriminate against a community that is multi-ethnic and be accused of doing it because of ethnic reasons, right? So my point here is that there are a lot of things that structurally divide us, and those are some things we have to work on. And I think the ministry, when the current regime came into power in 2015, and the Ministry of Social Cohesion was established, I could remember sending a policy brief laying out some of the interventions that I think that ministry should make, right? And that ministry has become a colossal failure. I think I should say so, right? But there are a lot of things that can be done. First of all, to lessen and minimize the ethnic competition, the ethnic distrust, and lay the basis for the kind of collective identity that we need emerging from our peoples, right? But before that can happen, that cannot happen when there are deep-rooted structural issues separating our people. For that to happen, we must address these. We must address the non-representation or the underrepresentation of Afro-Guyanese in the commercial sector, or the underrepresentation of Indo-Guyanese in public sector, and things like those. We have to address those structural issues before we get on to these more non-structural issues. That's my point.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Before we proceed to other questions, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of our Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Karen Cummins. I see you are one of our listeners here tonight, so thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Norton, in your presentation, you spoke about establishing a system of governance where we can have equity. My question to you is, what can that system of governance look like? And I see in the chat box a question that also comes from your presentation, where Dr. Isaac says, what practical steps can we take as a Guyanese society to implement a bipartisan approach to public service without acting within our political identity? You're currently muted, Mr. Norton.
Okay. It appears as though you were muting me. I am not muting myself.
It was me.
Now, let me say this. I understand what Dr. Edwards is trying to say, but I don't agree. And I ask people this question all the time. Why should the Amerindian people in Region 3, in Region 9 and 1, have to experience people from the coast going to do construction work there? Why can't we train them and so they can get the government contracts and build the things in those areas? Don't tell me that if we go into agriculture, it creates a conflict. It cannot. I believe, for instance, I've advocated this for years, every community should be producing its own food. Once you have to depend on people for your food, you have to fight for personal independence. So I wanted to say that there are a number of concrete steps that can be taken to ensure equity. I've just given you cases where I believe in certain Amerindian villages, in certain African villages, and even in some Indo-Guyanese villages that are in poverty, measures can be taken to give poor people the resources to develop. A lot of times we break this down to Indo and Afro and Amerindian, but the real issue at the bottom is poverty. And I believe the resources of this country, based on equity should go to people in poverty. Explain to me why a man is a multimillionaire, he has all the money, all the equipment, and you until now design contracts in a way that only those people can get it, rather than design it in a way that others who fall outside of the multimillionaire area can get. So I'm saying at the level of procurement, the rules can be changed and adopted to ensure people who are less fortunate benefit. Then I hold the view that one of the things we need to do to deal with some of the ethnic problems we have, when the PPP is in government, AP and UAFC supporters feel left out, and vice versa. There are countries that use a weighted majority for the budget. Rather than passing the budget with 51%, I would up the amount of votes you need so that the political groups will need to discuss and arrive at allocation of resources. Let us not forget, politics is about the use of authority to allocate resources. When you have a system with 51%, the 51% allocates resources to itself and to those it managed to win over from the other side. When you have a higher majority in which they have to bargain, when somebody comes with a budget that doesn't cater for a community, you have the bargaining chip of saying, you can only get my votes if these elements of discrimination are removed and these communities get based on their needs. I just give you a few, but there are a number of measures that can be taken to ensure we move the society in the direction of equity and good governance.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Another question coming from Dunessa. Do you believe there is a major issue with Afro-Guyanese sustaining businesses? If yes, what seems to be the major hindrance? And the follow-up question for that, it would seem to me that if the economy is driven by entrepreneurship, then most of the problems that surround ethnic and racial biases would be less. That's simple.
The assumption in the last statement, is that there'll be some smooth road to economic prosperity. It's a rough road. Now, I do not believe that Afro-Guyanese have inherent problems of entrepreneurship because they are African Guyanese. I believe they have problems because of structural barriers and cultural barriers. Whether you like it or not, for whatever reason, if you go to certain banks, they don't give Afro-Guyanese the resources to become involved in business. And so a lot of times you start failing. When you look at the structure of the society and where wealth is, every business needs support. Unfortunately for the Afro-Guyanese community, a lot of the support aren't there. And if you look at government structure, let us look at when the PPP was in government. Yes, there were some Afro-Guyanese who benefited, but they had to compromise their position. We need a system in which people can benefit and hold whatever political persuasion or political views they have. You are seeing in Guyana a situation where the economic ruling class, in large measure, is anti-African. And I make no apologies for saying that. I can sit down and give the evidence. Look, while we were in opposition, I know people who wrote letters to get employment, and they didn't even get a response. They changed and put a name that looks like an Indian, and they got responses. I know people in Buxton who, when they were applying for jobs, had to apply for a job using an address somewhere else because the society was stigmatized. Then we are fed this fallacy that we can't do business. Now, I also want to make the point that if we, in a structured approach, teach our children, etc., financial literacy and financial management, and they're exposed, they will. I want to make one last point. I grew up in my father's shop. And my father was a businessman in Linden. And my father focused me on getting education. I believe we have to now have a dual focus, where we tell our young people to get education, but get them involved in business so they develop the skills. Business is practice, not theory. You have to be in it. And I believe if we can do those things, we can begin the process of emancipating African Guyanese.
Just a quick one to give some support to Mr. Norton, and just to make a quick point, Ms. Harry. I think the questions asked for both Dr. Edwards and Mr. Norton as it relates to our ability is many times, it is lost many times in history because we many times believe in our own selves currently that where can we find it? We had such principles, as I mentioned, coming out of the struggles for self-determination. Last within that was the village movement, critical to Afro-Guyanese development. So we're asking, how do we economically empower ourselves? And we have history on our side, which taught us that even if we choose to do that against the best system, it is vulnerable. And that is exactly what happened to the village movement. It became vulnerable to the crown that repossessed lands and dismantled a movement that was on the verge of empowering Black people in this country, Afro-Guyanese, that not only in the level of politics and administration, but economics, and in the quest for promotion of economics through agriculture and all the other means of doing so. So again, my fundamental argument remains, as we tie independence and self-determination to nationhood, it goes without saying that at some point we take for granted, and Mr. Norton mentioned the issue of our Amerindian brothers and sisters, the suffering of each other. We take for granted the injustices perpetrated against each other in this country that builds a fundamental mistrust on the things that we choose to do. So even we had a Forbes Burnham Black government, and we have what is considered even as a coalition, a Black government. Where do we see ourselves as a people, whether economically empowered or politically well organized to overcome many of these challenges? We are still here. So the system is still going to be there to ensure that even the best movements, like the village movement, find challenges. And that's all I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solomon. One of the panelists actually asked this question in the group: what does it mean to be Guyanese? I guess it's important, especially at this time when we're gearing up to celebrate independence and everyone puts on their national colors. But what exactly does it mean to be Guyanese? And I know that each of you will have different answers to that, but let me hear your answers on that. Mr. Norton, do you want to go first? Since you've been Guyanese longer than the other two men.
I said very early that this is a divided society. And what we need is structures and changes that will seek to deal with the ethnic, class, and other barriers. Once it is before elections, a little while before elections, we operate as Guyanese. We share a lot of the cultural things together. But when it comes to political and economic power, we are still to foster a Guyanese culture. And so I would want to say, at this stage, we occupy the space called Guyana. We have been fairly tolerant of each other religiously, socioculturally, but politically and economically, we have been at it. So I would say that we are still in the process of building a nation, but we are not close.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Mr. Edwards.
I think my very short but humorous response to that question would be that if you have equal love for curry and roti, cocoa rice, and pepper pot, you're enough of a Guyanese for me, right? But apart from that, however, is that there are certain ideals, there are certain things we share with other parts of the Caribbean, and there are certain experiences and ideals that set us apart from other parts of the Caribbean. Those that we share with other parts of the Caribbean, which makes us more regional rather than Guyanese, are the Creole culture. The difference in Guyana is that we have an Afro-Creole culture and we also have an Indo-Creole culture that for some reason, the hybrid between the two as what is, I think this is more happening in Trinidad than in Guyana, where you have that the hybridization of the Afro and Indo-Creole, and you see it in music such as chutney and so forth, right? So we still have these two variants of our local culture living like apart from each other and coming together slower than we would want them to come together, right? So being Guyanese is an immersion in those culture with a level of pride, right? Being Guyanese is a recognition of where we've come from and the recognition of some of the struggles that that beset us and that we've managed to overcome, and many of the obstacles that are still in front of us, and our commitment to try to overcome these struggles, overcome these barriers for the benefit of all of us rather than some of us, right? And I think it might sound very philosophical and broad, but I think as Guyanese, our collective identity hinges on how best we could forge unity in our diverse cultural expressions, right? And so things like the celebration of Pagua that a lot of Afro-Guyanese take part in, I think those are instances in which you see the full Guyanese-ness coming out, celebrating Pagua, celebrating Diwali. So irrespective of which ethnic group you are, I could know coming up as a very small guy, Diwali, everyone going and spin the cotton wool and light up the cotton wool and spin. Everyone going to take part in the throwing of the water and those kind on anyone. Then and of course at events such as Emancipation, we want to see people that are more than just Afro-Guyanese. You want to see indigenous Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese taking part in those like national events and so forth. So for me, being Guyanese hinges on all the appreciation that we have for our diversity as a Guyanese nation.
Thank you. Mr. Solomon.
being Guyanese, that's a question that says the things that we do, how we appreciate them. And I would say that I'm very critical of this matter. So on the part to say that these celebrations we hold, I see them as very cosmetic. Because at a time like now, we now know that many of us are not Guyanese in the eyes of some of us. So, and I think that is the reality of what we are living at right now as we speak. History is a good guide for me is everything that we do. And I mentioned earlier about the civil rights movement in America. And and it comes from Mr. Lovelace's perspective again about welcoming to ensure that we break that issue of trust. There is a quest even after the civil rights movement to try to be an American, because there is a continuous means by which you are striving. I think in this part of the world, in Guyana, where we had our independence and we pegging back 54 years and how critical that was, we had that interest up until that point to be Guyanese. There was a common enemy, which was our colonial master, that notwithstanding the underlying mistrust that we had, we were prepared, whether it was Forbes Barnum and Cheddi Jagan, despite those who were leading up to the independence movement, whether it was the parties being split, there was still that common Guyanese intent to see a Guyana, to see an independent Guyana, to see what it was like then as a collective. And I believe because we lost that issue of trust, and we have to find that means by which we get that back. We can throw water on each other as much as we want. When election time come around, I don't believe so many people will be watering each other, especially after elections. So to be Guyanese for me is for us to appreciate how do we welcome each other, and to sincerely appreciate that the struggles fought and waged by one another is to be respected, because they all contribute to the fabric of this nation that makes what Guyana is. And until I could appreciate that and someone else that looks different from me could appreciate that, then we will call that the Guyanese-ness. Otherwise than that, we'll call it you own, they own, and somebody else own, and not Guyana's own. So that would be my contribution to the issue of, if you want to determine if you're Guyanese, you have to break the issue of mistrust among the races so that we can appreciate the struggles of each other. That is our Guyanese-ness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solomon. Our final question for tonight comes from Mike. He says, I believe that more must be done from a bottom-up approach. The family unit in Black communities is broken, and until we find a way to fix that, the foundation for developing the African communities will not be there. The real question should be, how do we fix our family units?
Actually, you skipped a question. The second to last question was directed to Mr. Norton. It said, to Mr. Norton, moving forward past the COVID-19 pandemic and our current political unrest, do you think our political and management structure will change moving forward? So those are the final two questions. So I'll let Mr. Norton answer the question from Mike. And then the other two panelists can take the final question.
I would say it is dependent on what the political elite does. If the political elite is prepared to sit and discuss and make compromises, we can see a movement towards creating a kind of an inclusive society. But like I said, it has to do with the governance structure. I wrote an article years ago in a book called Conflict Resolution, in which I'd identified 6 problems that Guyana need to tangle with. One was the problem of elections, everything about it. And two, the problem of majoritarian rule, where a 51, 53, 54% could determine what happens. One of the flaws of democracy, or so-called democracy, was made clear by John Stuart Mill. He said years ago that one has to be very, very careful with the majority, because the majority doesn't necessarily lead to democracy. It could become the tyranny of the majority. In other words, a majority could suppress a minority. And so we have got to look past this period and seek to become involved in dialogue, etc., and to find solutions for the problems of Guyana. I want to close this element by saying, we must not fool ourselves. There are always people in a society who benefit from division. And to the extent they are benefiting from division, they are not going to make a process of reconciliation easy. I want to give an example. Years ago, I was involved in negotiations between the the PNC and the PPP. And we met and we discussed and we agreed that regions, if you want a region, you should appoint the RU. And we sat around this table, PPP, PNC, and agreed. The PPP then went back to their headquarters and came back and said a particular person didn't accept it and it couldn't happen. Joe Hamilton can talk about that. He was in the PNC team at the time. And I'm saying this to say to you that even as you try to have negotiations and discussion, in all political parties, there are people who don't want to see them solved. So it is a tedious task of bringing more people on the side of a dialogue and some system of governance that will serve all. And there is where we have to look in the future, because these election issues, we can resolve it and one or the other become government, but the deep-rooted governance issues will not be resolved. A lot of the private sector people you see running up and down, their interest is not Guyana. Their interest is the money they can make. And it doesn't matter if it is at the expense of poor Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, or Amerindian Guyanese. They will clad it in a covering that make the poor that they are dispossessing feel comfortable. One of the things about hegemony is where you cause people to accept even the domination.
Mr. Edwards or Mr. Solomon, anyone of you can take this question.
Okay, I will start by making reference to a very popular African saying that it takes a village. And I think that is apt, especially in these times in which the traditional family structure is by and large on the decline. So the traditional family that we're accustomed to and the role that the traditional family played, it has become very problematic, especially in economic times like these, where economic demands are pulling the parents out of the family to spend more time in the world of work than in the world of the family, than in the sphere of the family. So the role of, so the family by and large is fulfilling, of course, its biological reproduction role, but it's being slowly crippled with the extent to which it can fulfill its social reproduction role. But as you say, nature just as society, or society just as nature, abhors a void. So with the weakening of the family, there are institutions that now need to step in to fulfill the kinds of socialization process that is necessary for the development of a wholesome human being, right? And which is why, as I started with the African saying that it takes a village. So as important as the family is in the traditional sense, economic realities have crippled the family to such an extent that many of the waking hours of parents are spent outside of the home, which means that the process or the task of socialization is currently being done by other institutions other than the family or in complement with the family. And these other institutions, whether they be the school system, whether they be whatever it is, must step in and help fulfill those roles. So it means that other community-based institutions must step up and help the family in the very important function of social reproduction, which means to engender a whole and a wholesome human being. And in the Afrocentric context, that is a human being that is conscious of his or her Afrocentric realities. So we might talk about the family and the need to fix the family, a very hard task based on the economic circumstances and realities in which we find ourselves. But my point is that all is not lost. Where what the family cannot do, other institutions, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and these other civil society institutions must step up and complement the family in its role in socializing the next generation.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon.
So just quickly, because I'll take this from two perspectives, but I'll give a lot of support to Doctor's position. But just first, the question in itself opens itself to a definition of what is African, because there's an interpretation that may go different in terms of then how do we then, as an African understanding, better our condition, more so the family. So I think that should be first defined before we move forward, because these days there are many contexts that are given to the elements that make up what some people consider to be an African family. So
Mr. Edwards or Mr. Solomon, anyone of you can take this question.
Okay, I will start by making reference to a very popular African saying that it takes a village. And I think that is apt, especially in these times in which the traditional family structure is by and large on the decline. So the traditional family that we're accustomed to and the role that the traditional family played, it has become very problematic, especially in economic times like these, where economic demands are pulling the parents out of the family to spend more time in the world of work than in the world of the family, than in the sphere of the family. So the role of, so the family by and large is fulfilling, of course, its biological reproduction role, but it's being slowly crippled with the extent to which it can fulfill its social reproduction role. But as you say, nature just as society, or society just as nature, abhors a void. So with the weakening of the family, there are institutions that now need to step in to fulfill the kinds of socialization process that is necessary for the development of a wholesome human being, right? And which is why, as I started with the African saying that it takes a village. So as important as the family is in the traditional sense, economic realities have crippled the family to such an extent that many of the waking hours of parents are spent outside of the home, which means that the process or the task of socialization is currently being done by other institutions other than the family or in complement with the family. And these other institutions, whether they be the school system, whether they be whatever it is, must step in and help fulfill those roles. So it means that other community-based institutions must step up and help the family in the very important function of social reproduction, which means to engender a whole and a wholesome human being. And in the Afrocentric context, that is a human being that is conscious of his or her Afrocentric realities. So we might talk about the family and the need to fix the family, a very hard task based on the economic circumstances and realities in which we find ourselves. But my point is that all is not lost. Where what the family cannot do, other institutions, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and these other civil society institutions must step up and complement the family in its role in socializing the next generation.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon.
So just quickly, because I'll take this from two perspectives, but I'll give a lot of support to Doctor's position. But just first, the question in itself opens itself to a definition of what is African, because there's an interpretation that may go different in terms of then how do we then, as an African understanding, better our condition, more so the family. So I think that should be first defined before we move forward, because these days there are many contexts that are given to the elements that make up what some people consider to be an African family. So it's very important to note that being one of the social institutions that make up our society, the family, more so the African family, those other institutions become very relevant to ensure in this globalized world that we're in, and for so many pressures that are now placed on the family, that these other social institutions become very relevant, such as economics. And we know, especially in Afro-Guyanese family, there is a single parent domination, and that did not arrive by chance. That is from the plantation, where that is what was structured as how our families were brought out in terms of enslaved African moving from plantation to plantation and not being with his family. Those are cultural dynamics that still hold relevance to some extent, and we are still fighting to correct elements such as those. So those are the social institutions like religion. How do we have, in the absence of those parents that now become single parent, support from religious organizations? Economics in terms of more Afro-Guyanese women are security guards and leaving children home unattended. How do we get more economic support to ensure that the family is not faced with such challenges? How do we ensure that education work to address those issues that have been affecting the African family, whether it's through the curriculum? Do we need a different structuring? And I think fundamental to this issue of back to independence and back to nationhood is how have we evolved as a nation, respecting what education can do for the particular races, including the Afro-Guyanese race that makes up the Afro-Guyanese family. So I think those institutions become even more relevant to ensure that we have just the definition that is being requested or being sought of how do we better the Afro-Guyanese family. Those institutions become more relevant now. That would be my response.
Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon. And thank you to our other panelists, Dr. Dwayne Edwards and Mr. Aubrey Norton. They have certainly given us a lot of information to think about. And this is the kind of meaningful discourse that I want to encourage all of our participants to have with each other, with your peers, with your friends, with your family members as we approach our 54th independence anniversary. This is the kind of meaningful discourse that can move Guyana in the direction of further development. So thank you so much to our panelists for participating in this segment of the program. And I want all of you to stay in your seat. Don't sneak out of the Zoom meeting. We have up next a poem by Dr. Terrence Isaacs. He was our speaker last week, and I know a lot of you loved that session. He's an author, and of course, he is a poet. Dr. Isaacs, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. This one is called We Guyanese, and I think it's very important given the fact that this is an independence program. And here it goes. We Guyanese, we sons and daughters of this soil, and the blood of our ancestors who toiled is coursing through our veins. We were warriors with spears, massa and enslaved, indentured, and all those who paved the way for our freedom. We, the 1763 rebellion, cause resistance is in we history, there ain't no mystery. Just the same way that every single year may we remember our independence as we pay homage to our descendants, cause we Guyanese and proud. We Pacaraimers in the clouds, we our rivers and lush green plains, savannas and sweet sugar cane, El Dorado and gold. Bauxite and riches below, we are future, present, and our folklore, just like a Nancy story in a blackout. We hopscotch and sell out. Yes, we go all out because we are outstanding. We excel. We propel in future generations. We 6 races, 10 regions in a melting pot of cultural diversity. We laugh in the face of adversity as we pledge our allegiance to the flag. We are Chinese fried rice in a brown paper bag, and the unity you get when you mix that Buxton spice with 7 curry. We cook up pepper pot and paiwari. We shave ice and snow cone. We Guyanese to the bone. We, the good, the bad, and everything sad. But we still want people, even after 54, be sure that despite our differences, we still have more in common. We stay repping 592 24/7 because Guyana is more than just a paradise. You can call it heaven, whether at home or abroad. Our homeland we will always applaud. So on this day of jubilation, let's celebrate as one nation, as you, me, we, Guyanese.
Thank you very much, Dr. Isaacs, for that beautiful poem. We Guyanese, hashtag Guyana nice bad. So our final presentation for tonight, we're gonna have a national song by one of our executive members on the IDPADA-G Youth Committee, Ms. Shanetta. But before she performs, I just got a message that the food stalls have not been sold out as yet. We still have some Chinese fried rice and a pepper pot available. So before you go, ensure that you use some of your money in your pocket and ensure that you buy out the food stalls. So over to you, Shanetta.
There's a land just off the Atlantic, land of jungles, waterfalls, and sweet sceneries, where poor people farm the land and hunt the waters, and they all live in peace and harmony. This is Guyana, beautiful Guyana. This is Guyana, Guyana. Diamond seekers go in the interior, pulling their corioles under the falls, singing sweet calypso as they heave on their way to dig up the diamonds and the gold. With kite-shore tumbling through the river, how I love the chirps of the cheerful kiskadee as they throw their yellow breasts to the sky. This is Guyana, beautiful Guyana. This is Guyana, land where I was born. This is Guyana, independent and free. Oh, Guyana, beautiful Guyana.
Thank you very much, Miss Lowe, for that wonderful rendition of our national song. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our participants for tuning in tonight. I would like to thank Ms. Omaya Hall, Junior Calypso Monarch, for that beautiful rendition of the national anthem. I would like to thank Mr. Ben Louis for his excellent musical piece on the steel pan. And I would like to thank our three panelists, Dr. Edwards, Mr. Solomon, and Mr. Norton, for the excellent information that they would have provided tonight. And I would hope that we as young people will take time to do some introspection and see how we can apply this information to our lives as we seek to build Guyana. Over to you, Ms. Harry.
Don't leave just yet. We have something exciting for you at the end of the program. We won't have an intermission, so I would like you to feel free to take a bite as we go along the rest of the program. I know that Keishel from Linden has some lovely chicken in various flavors, so you can feel free to step on over to the chicken stand, right, Keishel? So I just wanted to join Matthew in thanking everyone for participating tonight and to encourage you to tune in to our Spill the Facts series next Thursday at 7 p.m. We will be talking a lot about opportunity creation and opportunity maximization. So that's an excellent topic for young adults and adolescents. You will get some excellent advice. Please remember to like our Facebook pages, IDPADA-G Youth Movement and the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana. Also follow us on Instagram, IDPADA-G. Make sure you see the official IDPADA-G account and follow us there for lots of updates. As we've come to the end of our program, please turn on your videos. We would love to see the excellent outfits that you are wearing, and we are going to take an independent selfie for our Facebook page. So please join me in turning on your videos. Let's take an independence selfie for our Facebook page just before we end the program. Everyone put on your best smiles. Matthew has his food. Are we ready for the selfie? The host will take the selfie for us. Say cheese. Guyana's independence, 54. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We've come to the end of our program. If you wore an Independence outfit tonight, please take a picture of yourself and tag our page. We will be checking through the photos. And if we like your outfit, we just might have a special gift for the person with the most likes. So take a picture in your outfit, post it on your Facebook page, tag our Facebook page in it, and if you have the most likes, we will give you a special prize. Thank you all for participating. This is the end of Spill the Facts. Have a good night, everyone, and happy early independence. Bye.